She walked barefoot through the canyon carrying a rifle and a wedding dress, searching for the man who never showed. Margaret Hartley stood at the altar for 3 hours before she understood that love was just another word for fool. The morning had begun with such promise, her mother's pearls cool against her throat, the white lace dress that had taken 6 months of careful stitching, the orange blossoms woven through her hair filling the small chapel with their sweet perfume. The pews had filled slowly, ranchers and their wives in their Sunday best, the smell of pomade and rosewater mixing with the dust that never quite left anything in perdition, New Mexico. By noon, the whispers had started. By 1 o'clock, they'd become a roar. By 2, even the priest had stopped making excuses and simply stood there, Bible hanging loose in his hands like a dead thing. "He ain't coming," someone finally said. Old Martha Jennings, who never could keep her mouth shut about anything. "That boy lit out at dawn. Saw him myself, riding hard toward the Canyonlands." Margaret's hands had stayed perfectly still, folded like white doves in her lap. But inside, something fundamental shifted, like a bone breaking so clean you don't feel it until you try to stand. The walk home should have been humiliating. Should have been. But Margaret found she'd left humiliation somewhere between the altar and the door, dropped it like a handkerchief she no longer needed. What remained was something harder, something that tasted like iron on her tongue. Her father's house sat at the edge of town, a 2-story testament to better days when the silver still ran rich in the hills. She climbed the stairs to his study, her train dragging behind her, catching on splinters that pulled threads loose. The room still smelled of his tobacco, though he'd been in the ground 6 months now. His Winchester hung above the mantel, but it was the Colt .45 in the drawer she wanted. The one he'd carried in the war. The one that had put 7 men in the ground, by his count. The letter was where her mother had hidden it, tucked behind the daguerreotype of Samuel in his army uniform. Her brother's face stared out at her, serious and young, frozen the day before he'd ridden out to meet Jacob about the mining claim. The day before Jacob Marsh, the man who should have been saying vows with her right now, had put a bullet in Samuel's back and taken everything. Her mother's handwriting shook across the page. "My darling Margaret, if you are reading this, then I am gone and Jacob has finally come calling. I tried to keep you from knowing, tried to let you love him despite what he done. But a mother's heart can only hold so many lies. He killed our Samuel. Killed him for the claim, for the gold, for nothing more than greed. I seen it in his eyes every time he looked at you, not love, but calculation. You were just another claim to stake. The sheriff won't help. The law don't reach men like Jacob Marsh. But your daddy's gun still speaks true. Kill him." Margaret read it twice. 3 times. Then she fed it to the lamp flame and watched her mother's words turn to ash. But the truth of them had already taken root, spreading through her chest like wildfire through dry grass. She found her riding clothes in the trunk at the foot of her bed, split skirt, leather boots, the kind of practical things she'd worn before Jacob had started calling, before she'd tried to become the kind of woman a man might stay for. But the wedding dress she kept on. Let it be a reminder. Let it be a shroud. The stable boy didn't question why the abandoned bride wanted her horse saddled. Didn't question the saddlebags heavy with provisions, the bedroll tight. His eyes stayed carefully fixed on the ground, though she could feel his pity following her like a shadow. Buttermilk was a good horse, steady and sure, named for her color and temperament both. She'd raised the mare from a foal, and the horse knew her weight, her moods, her silences. They rode out as the sun began its slow descent, painting the desert the color of blood and gold. The trail wasn't hard to find. Jacob had grown careless in his flight, or perhaps he simply didn't expect to be followed. Not by her. Men like Jacob Marsh thought women were made of softer stuff, lace and tears and resignation. They forgot that the frontier made everyone hard, that survival didn't distinguish between silk and leather. She made camp the first night 20 miles out, in a grove of cottonwoods by a stream that barely deserved the name. The wedding dress had already begun its transformation, the hem torn and dusty, the pristine white going grey. She sat by her small fire, the coat heavy across her lap, and practiced the motion. Draw, aim, squeeze. Her father had taught her when she was 12, after the Apache raids had started. Killing's easy, he'd said. It's the living after that's hard. She hadn't understood then. She was beginning to now. The coyotes sang their lonely songs to the stars, and Margaret listened, finding a kind of kinship in their hunger. She'd brought food but couldn't eat. Her stomach had closed itself off, making room for something else. Purpose, maybe. Or just a slow, careful nurturing of rage. When she slept, she dreamed of Samuel. Not dead, but laughing, teaching her to play poker with pebbles for chips. You got to learn to read a man's face, he said. Every liar's got a tell. Jacob's tell had been his hands. The way they moved over her skin like she was already a possession, something to be counted and stored away. She thought it was desire. Now she knew it for what it was, the touch of a thief, cataloguing his take. Dawn came pale and reluctant, and with it, the knowledge that she'd crossed some invisible border in the night. Not just the edge of the territory, but something else. The woman who'd stood at that altar, who'd waited 3 hours for love to show its face, she was as dead as Samuel now. What rode on was something else, something without a name yet. The wedding dress caught the morning light, and for a moment, she considered taking it off. But no. Let it tell the story. Let anyone who saw her know what kind of justice rode through their lens. A bride abandoned, armed with her father's gun and her mother's truth. She mounted Buttermilk and turned west, following the tracks that led deeper into the canyon lands. Somewhere out there, Jacob Marsh rode with her brother's blood on his hands and her trust shattered behind him like glass. The sun climbed higher, and Margaret rode on, the latter's words echoing with each hoofbeat, "Kill him. Kill him. Kill him." But first, she had to find him. And in the finding, she suspected, she would discover what kind of woman she was becoming, one bullet, 1 mile, one betrayal at a time. The language of smoke and silence 3 days into the desert, her white dress has turned the color of old bones. She follows his trail through ghost towns and graveyards, learning to read the story in hoofprints and campfire ashes. In a burnout trading post, she finds his first mistake, a witness he left breathing. The old Apache woman speaks only one word, monster. But monsters, she's learning, sometimes wear familiar faces. The desert was a book written in a language Margaret was only beginning to understand. Each broken twig, each overturned stone, each place where the red earth had been disturbed, they all told pieces of Jacob's story. A story of haste and fear, of a man who knew he was hunted even before she'd taken up the hunt. 3 days out from perdition, the wedding dress had transformed into something unrecognizable. The white silk had taken on the color of the land itself, rust and ochre, dust and shadow. The lace hung in tatters where the thorns had claimed their price. She'd torn strips from the train to bandage Buttermilk's leg where the mare had scraped against a sharp rock, and now the dress ended ragged at her calves, more shroud than gown. The trail led through places that had given up their ghosts years ago. Adobe walls melting back into the earth, wooden frames stripped clean by wind and time. In one abandoned homestead, she found a child's wooden horse, its painted eyes worn smooth by small hands. She left it where it lay. The desert was full of such testimonies, reminders of dreams that had withered under the unforgiving sun. On the morning of the fourth day, she found where Jacob had made camp. The ashes were cold but recent, and in them, she read his carelessness. Cigarette butts, store-bought, not rolled. The same brand he'd smoked while courting her, sitting on her father's porch, spinning stories about the future they'd build together. She picked one up, turned it between her fingers, then ground it to nothing beneath her boot heel. He'd left other signs too. An empty whiskey bottle glinting in the morning light. Boot prints that staggered rather than walked. Good. Let him drink. Let him dull whatever senses he had left. But it was the blood that made her pause. Just a few drops on a flat stone, dried to the color of old rust. Not enough to mean a serious wound, but enough to tell her he wasn't traveling easy. She studied the stone, the pattern of the drops, and felt nothing that could be called sympathy. Samuel's blood had soaked into the ground somewhere out here too, and no one had paused over it except their mother, searching for her son's body with tears streaming down her face. The sun climbed higher, a hammer beating against the anvil of the earth. Margaret had learned to ration her water carefully, but thirst was becoming a constant companion, dry and insistent as grief. She sucked on pebbles to keep the saliva flowing, an old trick her father had taught her. Everything useful she knew seemed to come from the date now. By afternoon, she reached the burnout trading post at Skeleton Creek. The wooden sign still hung at an angle, Hobson's Goods Sundries. But Hobson had been dead 5 years, killed in a raid, and the goods had long since been picked clean. What remained was a shell of scorched adobe and memories. She almost missed the smoke. Just a thin thread rising from behind the ruins, nearly invisible against the pale sky. Margaret dismounted slowly, hand moving to the Colt at her hip. The gun felt heavier each day, weighted with purpose. The old woman sat in the shade of a collapsed wall, tending a fire no bigger than a dinner plate. Apache, by the look of her, the geometric patterns on her faded dress, the way she held herself despite her obvious age. Her hair was white as bone, her face a map of every hard year the desert could deal. Margaret approached carefully, hands visible. She'd learned enough Apache to trade, though the words felt clumsy on her tongue. But the old woman spoke first, in English flavored with Spanish and something older. You follow the dead man. Not a question. Margaret nodded, seeing no point in denial. The wedding dress told its own story. The old woman's eyes, clouded with cataracts but still sharp, traveled over her slowly. He stopped here. Yesterday. Dawn. Was he alone? A nod. Then, unexpectedly, the woman spat into the fire. The flames hissed and danced. Monster. The word hung between them, stark and final. Margaret wanted to ask more, what had he done, what had she seen, but the old woman's face had closed like a door. Some stories weren't meant for sharing, only for surviving. Instead, Margaret reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a portion of her dried beef, her last apple. She set them beside the fire, an offering that was also a thank you. The old woman said nothing, but her gnarled hand covered the gifts like a blessing. He goes to Golgotha, the woman said finally. The old mine. Where the earth bleeds gold and men bleed greed. Margaret knew the place. Everyone did. A played-out mine that had made fortunes and corpses in equal measure before the gold ran dry. If Jacob was heading there, he had a reason. Maybe he thought to hide in the tunnels. Maybe he had friends among the outcasts and claim jumpers who still scratch at the dead veins of awe. Or maybe he was just running to ground like any wounded animal. She stood to leave, but the old woman's voice stopped her. The dress. It makes you heavy. Margaret looked down at the ruined silk, the weight of it pulling at her shoulders. Yes. Good. Weight remembers. Weight carries purpose. The old woman's blind eyes seem to see through her. But when the time comes, you choose. Carry the weight or let it carry you. Cryptic words, but Margaret had grown used to the desert's riddles. She mounted Buttermilk and rode on, leaving the old woman to her small fire and great silences. The trail to Golgotha was clearer now. Jacob had stopped trying to hide his tracks, either from desperation or arrogance. She found where he'd watered his horse at a seep, the hoofprints deep and rushed. Found where he'd relieved himself behind a cluster of rocks, the smell still sharp in the dry air. Such ordinary, human signs from a man her mother had named a monster. But monsters, Margaret was learning, were just men who'd chosen badly and kept choosing. Each cruelty a decision, each betrayal a path taken. She thought of Jacob's hands on her waist as they danced at the harvest festival, the way he'd whispered promises into her hair. Had he already been planning Samuel's death then? Had her brother's murder been seasoning every sweet word? The sun began its descent, painting the rocks in shades of blood and flame. Golgotha was still a day's ride, maybe more. She made camp in a bowl of red rock that offered protection from the wind, building her fire small and smokeless. The night sound started up, coyotes, owls, the small deaths that darkness brought. She cleaned the cold by firelight, the ritual soothing in its familiarity. Oil and cloth, the soft snick of metal against metal. 6 chambers, 6 chances. Her father had always said a gun was just a tool, no different from a hammer or a plow. But sitting there in her ruined wedding dress, with her brother's ghost for company and justice riding heavy in her chest, Margaret knew better. A gun was a question. And somewhere in the dark, riding toward Golgotha, was her answer. The stars emerged one by one, cold and distant as God's own eyes. She lay back against her saddle, the cold within easy reach, and tried not to think about what came after. After the finding. After the confrontation. After whatever ending this story was writing itself toward. The old Apache woman had called Jacob a monster. But what did that make her, riding through the darkness with murder cradled in her hands like a newborn? The dress whispered against the rocks as she shifted, and she remembered the woman's words. Wade remembers. Yes. She would remember. Every step, every mile, every moment that had led from altar to desert. And when she found him, when she finally stood before the man who should have been her husband, she would let the weight of memory guide her hand. The fire died to embers, and still she lay awake, reading the story written in the stars. Somewhere, a night bird called, lonely, searching. She wondered if Jacob heard it too, if he lay awake knowing she was coming. If he remembered Samuel's face in the moment before he pulled the trigger. Tomorrow would bring her closer. Tonight, she practiced the words she might say, the questions she might ask. But they all crumbled to dust in her mouth, meaningless as the promises he'd made. In the end, there would be only the gun, the moment, the choice. And the weight of the dress, dragging behind her like all the ghosts she'd gathered on the trail. Blood moon testimony. The trail leads to a canyon where the walls with red iron. She finds him at last, but he's not alone. A child clings to his leg, calling him Papa. The man she was to marry wears 2 faces, killer and father, betrayer and protector. Her finger finds the trigger, but the child has her dead brother's eyes. Some bullets, once chambered, become questions instead of answers. The approach to Golgotha was a descent into the earth's raw wound. Red rock walls rose on either side, streaked with iron oxide that wept rust-colored tears when the rare rains came. The old mining road was barely visible now, reclaimed by sage and creosote, but Buttermilk picked her way carefully among the stones, sure-footed as only a desert horse could be. Margaret had expected guards, lookouts, some sign of vigilance. But the entrance to the camp was unwatched, arrogance or desperation, she couldn't say which. The smell hit her first, wood smoke, coffee, and underneath it something else. Fierce sweat. The kind that comes from running too long. She left buttermilk tied to a dead juniper a quarter-mile back, approaching on foot. The wedding dress had become her camouflage now, its dirty white invisible against the pale rocks in the fading light. The Colt sat heavy in her hand, all 6 chambers loaded, though her father had always carried only 5. "Keep the hammer on an empty chamber," he'd said. "Safety first." But safety was a luxury she'd left at the altar. Their voices reached her before she saw them. 3 men, maybe 4, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. And then, Jacob's laugh. The same laugh that had charmed her mother, that had filled her father's parlor, that had promised her everything under the stars. Her finger found the trigger before she'd even made the conscious choice. She crept closer, using a fallen boulder for cover. The camp spread below her in a natural bowl of rock, 3 men around a fire, saddlebags scattered, horses picketed near a seat that leaked precious water. They were dividing something, passing bags between them, the soft clink of gold unmistakable. Samuel's gold. Her brother's life reduced to yellow metal and greed. Jacob sat with his back to her, but she would have known him anywhere. The way he held his shoulders, the tilt of his head, the careful way he moved his hands. He'd lost weight in his flight, his shirt hung loose, and when he turned to pass a bottle to the man beside him, she saw the shadow of exhaustion under his eyes. "Should have seen her face," one of the men was saying. A thick-bodied stranger with a scar that split his left eyebrow. 3 hours. Sitting there like a statue in all that white. "Shut up, Cray," Jacob said, but there was no heat in it. Just tired acceptance. "No, no, let him tell it," the third man urged. Younger, with the kind of nervous energy that made Margaret think of coyotes. "I want to hear about the great Jacob Marsh, leaving a pretty piece at the altar." "Wasn't just pretty," Cray continued, warming to his story. "That's Sam Hartley's sister. You know, the one you—" I said shut up. This time there was warning in Jacob's voice, and Cray subsided. But the damage was done. They knew. They all knew what he'd done, and they were here anyway, dividing the blood price of her brother's life. Margaret raised the Colt, sighting down the barrel at the back of Jacob's head. One squeeze. One moment. Justice delivered clean and simple, the way her mother's letter had demanded. Her hand was steady, all those hours of practice paying off now when it mattered. But then a sound froze her finger on the trigger. Not from the camp, from behind her. A small cough, quickly stifled. She turned, gun swinging toward the new threat, and found herself staring at a child. A boy, maybe 6 or 7, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that had seen better days. He stood 10 feet away, eyes wide with fear or fascination, she couldn't tell which. In his arms, he clutched a threadbare blanket and what looked like a wooden soldier, carved rough but with care. For a moment, neither moved. Then the boy opened his mouth, and Margaret knew he was about to scream, to alert the camp. She lunged forward, free hand clamping over his mouth, dragging him behind the boulder. He struggled, thin limbs flailing, but she held tight. "Shoo," she whispered. "Shoo. I won't hurt you." The child's eyes, brown, white, terrified, stared up at her. And in them, she saw something that made her stomach drop. The shape of them, the way they crinkled at the corners. Samuel's eyes. Her brother's eyes in this strange child's face. Popper. The word was muffled against her palm, but she heard it clear enough. The boy was trying to call for his father. For someone in that camp. For Danny. Jacob's voice, sharp with concern. Danny, where'd you go? Margaret's mind raced. The child couldn't be Jacob's, the age was wrong, the timing impossible. But those eyes. I'm going to let you go, she whispered to the boy. But you have to be quiet. Can you do that? A small nod. She released him slowly, ready to grab him again if he screamed. But he just stared at her, taking in the ruined dress, the gun, the wild look she knew must be in her eyes. You're the bright lady, he said, voice small but certain. Popper showed me your picture. The words hit like physical blows. Popper. Your picture. This child knew her, knew about her, had some connection to Jacob that she didn't understand. Dear knee. Jacob's voice was closer now, footsteps approaching their hiding spot. The boy looked between her and the direction of the voice, torn. Then, in a move that shocked her, he pressed against her side, hiding behind the fall of her dress. Don't let him find me, he whispered. Please. Jacob appeared around the edge of the boulder, and for the first time in days, Margaret looked upon the face of the man she'd thought to marry. He'd aged in their time apart, lines carved deep by sun and stress, a healing cut along his jaw. His hand rested on his gun, but he hadn't drawn. Not yet. His eyes found her, and something complex passed over his face. Surprise, yes, but also something that looked almost like relief. Then his gaze dropped to the boy partially hidden behind her, and his expression hardened. Let him go, Margaret. She kept the cold train on his chest. Whose child is this? Mine. The word came out clipped, defensive. Liar. But even as she said it, she was doing the math, seeing those familiar eyes. He's too old to be yours. Unless I had him before I ever came to perdition. Before I ever met you. Jacob's voice was steady now, careful. His mother's dead. Has been for 2 years. The boy pressed closer to her side, and she felt him trembling. Nothing about this made sense. Why was the child afraid of his own father? Why did he have Samuel's eyes? What web of lies had she stumbled into? Popper's angry, the boy whispered, so quiet only she could hear. He gets angry now. Since Uncle Sam, Danny, come here. Jacob's voice cut through the child's words. Now. Uncle Sam. The words echoed in Margaret's mind like gunshots. Uncle Sam. Uncle. He's Samuel's son. The realization came out flat, certain. This boy is my brother's child. Jacob's face went very still. Behind him, she could hear the other men approaching, drawn by the commotion. Her tactical advantage was slipping away, but she couldn't seem to move, couldn't seem to think past the impossible truth taking shape. It's not what you think, Jacob said. Then tell me what it is. The cold never wavered, but her voice did. Tell me why my brother's son calls you Popper. Tell me why he's afraid of you. Tell me what happened out there in the desert. Jake. Cray's voice, coming closer. You find the boy? Stay back, Jacob called without turning. Everything's fine. But everything was not fine. The child, Danny, her nephew, Samuel's son, was shaking now, caught between two people with guns and history and hurt. Margaret made a decision that came from instinct rather than thought. She holstered the Colt and knelt, bringing herself to the boy's eye level. "Danny," she said softly. "I'm your Aunt Margaret. Your father, your real father, was my brother. Do you understand?" The boy nodded slowly. "Papa Jake said you might come. Said you'd be angry about Uncle Sam going to heaven." "Uncle Sam. Papa Jake." The words were a knife between her ribs. She looked up at Jacob, searching his face for answers. "How long? How long have you been raising my brother's son?" 2 years. His voice was rough. "Since his mother died. She was Apache. Your brother loved her, but he couldn't bring her home. You know how your father was about, don't?" The word came out sharp. "Don't you dare blame this on my father." The other men had reached them now, Cray and the younger one, hands on their guns but uncertain. The scene before them, a woman in a destroyed wedding dress, a child, their partner facing them down, it wasn't what they expected. "Is this the Hartley woman?" Cray asked. "Jake, what's going on?" Margaret stood slowly, hand returning to her gun. "Yes, I'm the Hartley woman. The one whose brother you helped murder. The one whose nephew you've been hiding. Murder." The younger man looked between them, nervous energy crackling. "Jake, you said it was self-defense. You said, 'Shut up, Will.'" Jacob's voice was tired, defeated. "Just, everyone shut up for a minute." But Margaret was done with silence. Done with waiting. "Tell me what happened. All of it. Or I swear by my brother's grave, Uncle Sam doesn't have a grave," Danny said, small voice cutting through her threat. "Papa Jake couldn't find his body after the bad men took him." The words rearranged everything Margaret thought she knew. She stared at Jacob, seeing him now as if for the first time. The exhaustion wasn't from running. The cut on his jaw wasn't from carelessness. The way he stood, protective even now, between her and the other man. "The gold," she said slowly. "It's not from the claim. It's, what? Blood money? Payment?" Jacob's shoulders sagged. "Bounty. On the man who killed him. Took me 6 months to track them all down." "You're lying." But even as she said it, she was remembering her mother's letter. The certainty in it. The hate. Based on what? Who had told her mother that Jacob killed Samuel? "The wedding," she said, pieces falling into place. "You didn't run because you were guilty. You ran because Danny's grandfather found us. Samuel's wife's father. He wanted the boy, said no white man had the right to raise his grandson. Said he'd kill me if I didn't hand him over." Jacob's voice was steady now, the truth finally flowing. I couldn't let you get caught in the middle. Couldn't bring that danger to your door. So I ran. Took Danny and ran." Margaret felt the world tilting, everything she'd believed for days crumbling like ancient adobe. The dress suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds, dragging at her shoulders. The gun in her hand felt wrong, pointed at the wrong man, carrying the wrong purpose. "My mother's letter," she said. "She said you killed him. Your mother believed what she needed to believe. What was easier than the truth?" Jacob's eyes were set now, older than his years. "That Samuel loved an Apache woman. Had a child with her. Died protecting them from men who thought mixing blood was worse than murder. The boy, Danny, her nephew, all that was left of Samuel, tugged at her ruined dress. Are you going to shoot Papa Jake?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Around them, The other men waited, hands on guns, the gold at their feet forgotten. The canyon walls seemed to lean in, waiting for her answer. Margaret looked down at the boy's face, Samuel's eyes in a child's face, familiar and strange all at once. Then at Jacob, who'd raised this child, who'd hunted her brother's killers, who'd left her at the altar to protect them both from a violence she hadn't even known existed. "No," she said quietly, holstering the Colt. "No, I'm not going to shoot him." The relief on the boy's face was painful to see. He threw his arms around her waist, burying his face in the dirty silk. "I knew you were good. Papa Jake said you were good, even when you were scary." Over the child's head, she met Jacob's eyes. There was too much there to process, grief, regret, a question he wasn't quite asking. Behind him, the other men relaxed, Cray spitting into the dirt. "Well," Cray said. "This is touching and all, but we've still got Apache trackers on our tail and a bounty to divide. Jake, what's the plan?" But Margaret wasn't listening to the talk of logistics and escape. She was holding her brother's son, feeling the solid weight of him, the proof that Samuel had lived and loved and left something behind besides grief. The wedding dress, which had carried her this far on a mission of vengeance, suddenly felt like what it was, just cloth. Just the remnant of a life that had never really existed. "There's more," Jacob said quietly. "About Samuel. About how he died. About why. But not here. Not now." He gestured to the descending darkness, to the men waiting for his lead. "Come with us. Let me tell you all of it. Then decide what you want to do." Margaret looked at the gun on her hip, at the child in her arms, at the man she'd ridden through hell to kill. The desert had taught her to read signs, but this required a different kind of literacy. The ability to read the human heart, to parse truth from justified lies. "Uncle Sam told me stories," Danny said, voice muffled against her dress. "About his sister who could shoot bottles off a fence post. Who rode better than any of the boys." "Was that you?" "Yes," she whispered. "That was me." He said you were brave. Braver than anybody. The child pulled back, looking up at her with those heartbreaking familiar eyes. "Are you brave enough to help Papa Jake? The bad men are coming." And there it was. The question she'd ridden days to avoid. Not whether she could kill, but whether she could choose not to. Whether she could take the weight of her grief and transform it into something else, protection, maybe. Or even understanding. "Jake," Cray said, urgency creeping into his voice. "We need to move. Now." Margaret made her decision. "My horse is tethered a quarter-mile back. Buttermilk. She's strong enough to carry two." Jacob's eyes widened slightly, surprised at the offer, at the shift in alliance. "Danny rides with you?" She nodded. The boy was already hers in a way that went deeper than blood. Samuel's son. The nephew she'd never known existed. The family she'd thought was lost. As the men broke camp with practiced efficiency, Margaret found herself standing beside Jacob for a moment. Close enough to smell the trail dust on him, the coffee and gunpowder life he'd been living. "The letter," he said quietly. "What did it say exactly?" "That you killed him. That I should." She couldn't finish. The words seemed absurd now, with Danny helping to roll blankets, chattering about his wooden soldier. "She wasn't wrong," Jacob said. "I did kill him. By bringing danger to his door. By not being fast enough when they came. Stop." The word came out harder than she intended. "That's not the same thing." Isn't it? She didn't have an answer for that. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe guilt and responsibility were more complex than her mother's letter had allowed for. Maybe the desert had more to teach her about the weight of choices, the price of love, the strange shapes family could take. The moon was rising, red as blood through the dust on the horizon. A hunter's moon, her father would have called it. But she was done hunting, at least for tonight. Tomorrow would bring its own questions, Apache trackers, the truth about Samuel's death, what to do with this child who carried her brother's eyes and called another man Papa. But tonight, she would ride with strangers who might have been family, if the world had been kinder. She would hold her nephew and let the wedding dress continue its transformation, from shroud to shelter, from symbol of one life to the ragged beginning of another. What the desert keeps dawn breaks over 3 graves, one old, one fresh, one empty. The wedding dress lies in ashes beside a campfire where truth was finally spoken, her brother's death, the child's mother, the price of gold and grief. She rides east with the child behind her, her father's gun buried deep. The letter, unburned, travels with them, not an ending, but a different kind of promise. Some ghosts choose their own rest. The Apache trackers found them just before dawn, moving through the canyon like smoke given purpose. Margaret woke to Danny's small hand on her face and Jacob's whispered "Don't move" cutting through the grey light. They'd made camp in a shallow cave, the horses hidden in a cut of rock below, but it hadn't been enough. The first shot came from Cray's position. After that, everything became chaos and clarity mixed, the sharp crack of rifles, the whine of bullets off stone, the taste of gun smoke bitter in the morning air. Margaret pulled Danny deeper into the cave, her body a shield between him and the violence, while the wedding dress caught on the rough stone like it was trying to hold them back. "Stay down," she told him, though the boy needed no encouragement. He'd curl into himself, wooden soldier clutched tight, eyes squeezed shut. This child had seen too much already, she realized. Whatever peaceful life Samuel had tried to give him had been shattered long before today. The firefight was brief but decisive. When the shooting stopped, Will was dead, an Apache bullet through his throat. 2 of the trackers lay still among the rocks. Cray bled from a shoulder wound, cursing steady as rainfall. And Jacob stood at the cave mouth, rifle loose in his hands, staring at something in the growing light. "It's him," he said quietly. "Samuel's wife's father. Danny's grandfather." Margaret looked past him to see an old Apache warrior, dignified even in death, his rifle still pointed toward their shelter. The man who'd come for his grandson. Who'd driven Jacob from the altar, from her, from the life they might have built. Now just another body the desert would claim. "We need to bury them," she said. The words surprised her. She'd come here for vengeance, not funeral rites. But the weight of the day demanded acknowledgement, especially this grandfather who'd died trying to reclaim his blood. They worked through the morning heat, digging in the hard earth with whatever tools they had. Danny helped, his small hands moving stones, his face solemn. He didn't cry for the grandfather he'd never known, but Margaret saw him place a small yellow flower on the old man's chest before they covered him with earth. "Your mother would have wanted this," Jacob told the boy as they finished. "For him to be put to rest proper." It was the opening Margaret had waited for. "Tell me about her." About Samuel and her. All of it. So he did, there among the graves, while Cray bandaged his shoulder and the sun climbed toward its zenith. The story came in pieces, how Samuel had met Morning Star while trailing stolen horses. How they'd loved carefully, secretly, meeting in hidden places away from both their people's judgment. How Danny had been born in a wickiup under a harvest moon, with Samuel pacing outside like any expectant father. "Your brother wanted to bring them home," Jacob said. Wanted to marry her proper, raise Danny in town. But your father would never have allowed it. Margaret finished the thought, knowing it for truth. Their father's hate for the Apache had run deep as bedrock, fed by years of raids and reprisals. So Samuel kept them hidden. Built them a little place out past Skeleton Ridge. Visited when he could. I helped sometimes, brought supplies, kept watch. Jacob's voice carried old guilt. I should have been there that day. But I was in town, buying that damn ring for you. The irony of it burned. While Jacob had been planning their future, Samuel had been dying for his own. The men who killed him weren't Apache, as everyone assumed, but white claim jumpers who decided a race traitor deserved no mercy. They shot Samuel in the back, burned the cabin, left Morning Star to die of her wounds 2 days later. Only Danny survived, hidden in a root cellar, found by Jacob when he came looking. She made me promise, Jacob said. Morning Star. Before she died. Made me swear to keep Danny safe, to raise him as my own if needed. He looked at Margaret then, really looked at her. I couldn't tell you. Couldn't risk you knowing, your mother knowing. The town would have, I know what the town would have done. Margaret cut him off. She'd seen enough frontier justice to understand. A half-breed orphan would have been lucky to last a week. Danny had fallen asleep against her side, exhausted by violence and grave-digging. She studied his face, seeing Samuel there but also his mother, the straight nose, the shape of his mouth. Beautiful child, caught between worlds that wanted to tear him apart. The gold, she said. The bounty money. Every cent of it is his. For his future. For whatever life we can build him away from here. Jacob paused. If you're willing. He needs family. Real family. The proposition hung between them, heavy as the noon heat. Margaret thought of the wedding that never was, the life that had been promised and withdrawn. But she also thought of this child who called her aunt, who carried her brother's legacy in his blood and bones. There's something I need to do first, she said. She stood, walking to where her saddlebags lay. The ruined wedding dress dragged behind her, catching on every stone and thorn. At the remains of their campfire, she stopped, looking down at the silk and lace that had carried her this far. It had been many things, a symbol of hope, a shroud of revenge, a banner of her own foolishness. Now it was just cloth, stained with the desert's hard truths. She pulled her mother's letter from where she'd hidden it in the borders. The paper was creased, softened by sweat and travel, but the words remained clear: kill him. Such a simple directive. Such a complicated untrue. What's that? Cray asked, watching from where he sat nursing his shoulder. Old news, Margaret said, and fed the letter to the ashes. The paper caught quickly, her mother's grief and fury turning to smoke that the wind carried away. Then, with movements that felt like ceremony, she began to remove the dress. Underneath, she wore the practical clothes of travel, split skirt, cotton shirt, items that belonged to the woman she was becoming rather than the one she'd tried to be. The wedding dress pulled at her feet, a shed skin, a discarded future. Burn it? Jacob asked quietly. She considered, then shook her head. No. Let the desert keep it. Someone might need it someday, for bandages or shelter or their own kind of armor. She left it there, draped over a stone like an offering. The wind would take it eventually, tear it to shreds and memory. But for now, it marked this place, where truth had finally been spoken, where the date had been honored, where she'd chosen family over vengeance. They rode out as the sun began its descent, Cray heading north to find a doctor for his shoulder, the rest of them turning east toward the New Mexico territories. Danny rode with Margaret on buttermilk, his small body relaxing into sleep against her chest. The wooden soldier was tucked in her saddlebag, next to her father's colt which she'd cleaned and oiled but not fired. "Will you go back?" Jacob asked as they rode. "To perdition?" "No." The answer came without thought. "That woman, the one who waited at the altar, she's as dead as Samuel now. Let them tell whatever stories they want." They would, she knew. The abandoned bride who went mad with grief, who rode into the desert in her wedding dress and never returned. Let that be her ghost story, haunting the town's memory. The truth, this child, this strange new family forged from loss and necessity, belonged to no one but them. As they rode, Jacob told her more about Samuel's last years. The happiness he'd found with Morning Star, the pride in his son, the plans he'd made for bringing his family into the light. Her brother had lived the whole life she'd known nothing about, loved in ways their father would never have understood. The tragedy wasn't just his death, but all the hiding that had come before it. "He talked about you all the time," Jacob said. "How you'd love Danny. How you'd teach him to ride and shoot and read the weather. He was going to tell you, after the wedding. Thought it would be safer then, with you married and settled." Margaret almost laughed at that, the idea that marriage would have made her safe, would have cushioned the blow of truth. Instead, the desert had taught her harder lessons. About the weight of assumptions, the danger of incomplete stories, the way love could take shapes nobody expected. Danny stirred, murmuring something that might have been Papa or might have been Mama. Both were ghosts to him now, names attached to fading memory. But he would have new names to learn, Aunt Margaret, Uncle Jake if that's what came to pass. Not replacements, but additions to his small catalogue of family. There, Jacob pointed ahead to where a stream cut through cottonwoods, green against the red earth. "We'll camp there tonight. Tomorrow we can reach Lincoln, get supplies, figure out our next move." Our next move. The words should have felt strange, this partnership born from death and misunderstanding. But Margaret found them fitting easier than the wedding dress ever had. This was what remained after the fire, not what was planned, but what survived. As they made camp, Danny woke enough to help gather kindling, chattering about the wooden soldier's adventures. He moved between Margaret and Jacob easily, naturally, as if they'd always been this strange configuration of family. Children adapted, she realized. It was adults who got stuck in the shapes of what should have been. That night, as they sat around the fire eating beans and dried beef, Margaret found herself thinking about her mother's letter. Kill him. Such certainty in those words, such conviction that violence was the answer to loss. But the desert had taught her differently. Sometimes the answer was simpler and harder, to put down the gun, to listen to the whole truth, to choose the living over the dead. "And Margaret?" Danny's voice pulled her from thought. "Will you tell me a story? About Uncle Sam when he was little?" So she did, remembering her brother at Danny's age, wild and laughing and afraid of nothing. Jacob listened too, adding his own memories from their later friendship. They built Samuel again out of words, gave Danny pieces of the father he'd barely known. It wasn't enough, would never be enough, but it was what they had. When the boy finally slept, rolled in blankets between them like the child they might have had in another life, Margaret and Jacob sat in companionable silence. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched her ride out in a wedding dress with murder in her heart. Now she sat in practical clothes with her nephew sleeping nearby and her brother's killer, no, his friend, his protector of what remained, across the fire. "No regrets?" Jacob asked eventually. She considered the question, all its implications. About not killing you? No. A pause. About the rest? Ask me in a year. He nodded, understanding. They were writing new promises now, careful ones that accounted for the desert's teachings. No forevers, no certainty, just the commitment to try. To raise this boy between worlds. To honor the dead by living. To build something from the ashes of what they'd lost. The fire burned low, and still they sat, watching Danny sleep. In the morning, they would ride on toward Lincoln, toward supplies, indecisions, and whatever future they could cobble together. But tonight, they were just 3 souls around a campfire, carrying their ghosts gently, learning the weight of survival. Margaret thought of the wedding dress, probably already collecting dust and moonlight in the canyon. Someone would find it eventually, a traveler, a prospector, maybe another woman riding out with her own fury and grief. What would they make of it, this ruined testament to plans the desert had changed? Would they recognize it for what it was, not surrender, but transformation? The coyotes started up their evening song, and Danny shifted in his sleep, one small hand reaching out. Margaret caught it, held it, felt the pulse of Samuel's blood in those small fingers. This was what remained. This was what mattered. Not the gold in their saddlebags or the bodies in their wake, but this child who needed raising, this chance to choose family over the shapes the world expected. "We'll do right by him," Jacob said quietly. Not a question, but a vow. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "We will." And in that moment, with the stars as witness and the desert holding its breath, a new story began. Not the one anyone had expected, not the one the wedding dress had promised, but maybe, just maybe, the one that needed to be told. The desert kept its secrets close, but sometimes it gave things back transformed. A bride had ridden in, armed with righteousness and her mother's rage. What rode out was something harder to name, a woman who'd learned the weight of choice, an accidental mother to her brother's son, a partner in an endeavor that had no easy label. The wedding dress stayed behind, a white flag planted in no man's land, marking the place where one story ended and another began. In perdition, they would whisper about the bride who went mad. Let them. The truth was harder and simpler both, sometimes you had to bury your old self to let the new one breathe. Sometimes the desert taught lessons you never wanted to learn. Sometimes the best revenge was no revenge at all, just the patient work of living, of raising the next generation to be better than the last. The fire died to embers. The stars continued their ancient wheel. And somewhere in the darkness, a wedding dress collected dust and stories, waiting for the next woman who needed to shed her skin and be reborn.